Okay, I'm Kwong Chi Man. I am a local historian working on the military history of Hong Kong and East Asia in the past 10 years in Baptist University. I mainly write about the military history of Hong Kong and East Asia in the 20th century and late 19th century. So my focus is rather narrow, and usually I work on topics like military strategies and so on. But more recently, I also focus on the stories of the soldiers, especially the local servicemen, uh, the Hongkongers who served in the British Armed Forces in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Uh, there were many works about the Battle of Hong Kong. So all of them, of course, mentioned the role of the volunteers, but more recently, we started to dig up more stories about the locals who were not just the volunteers, but also the regular soldiers of the British Armed Forces. For example, by December 1941, there were around 2,000 Hong Kongers, non-British, let's put it this way, serving in the garrison. So there were hundreds of Hong Kong Chinese, hundreds of Eurasians, Portuguese, and some locally born Indians and so on, and people from around the world, in fact, served in different capacities, and not just volunteers, but also regulars in the armed forces. For example, there were many Hong Kong Chinese sappers who were enlisted in the Royal Engineers. So their history could be traced all the way back in the 1880s, when the British Army in Hong Kong started to recruit the locals to serve as sappers. So they in the 1930s, they received combat training. So some of them had fought in different areas in Hong Kong during the 18 Days Battle. And by November 1941, there was a small unit called Hong Kong Chinese Regiment being formed. It was not meant to be a small unit. It was meant to be a full machine gun battalion of 800 men. But the recruitment only started weeks before the outbreak of the war. So by December 1941, the unit had only 50 or so non-commissioned officers. So they too fought in the Battle of Hong Kong. Many of the Hong Kong Chinese servicemen of the British forces could not speak English. They spoke Cantonese at that time. And on the other hand, some of the Portuguese may not be able to speak in Cantonese. So you have to you witnessed sometimes things can be difficult, but at the end of the day, they sort of cooperated facing the common enemy. So this kind of things is kind of unique in Hong Kong's history, and I think it really should be brought up to attention. Hong Kong was actually a very important place during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1937 between, of course, Japan and China. So when Japan controlled the China coast, basically through blockade and occupying all the coastal cities in China, Hong Kong became one of the largest, if not the largest, window for the Chinese government to continue to receive foreign aid and continue to conduct trade between China and the rest of the world in order to for example, to gain the foreign currency first, and secondly, especially also more importantly, to import strategic materials, for example, tung oil, for example, machineries, for example, weapons, for example, all kinds of industrial products that could be used at war, which China could not produce itself throughout the war. So between 1937 and 1941, actually Hong Kong played quite a significant role in that regard, as a window to allow the Chinese to import strategic materials to sustain its war effort, because it sometimes even aircraft, parts of an aircraft could be imported through Hong Kong, so that they could not import an entire assembled aircraft, but parts of it, for example, a part of a wing, parts of the fuselage, and so on, they would be dismantled and it became boxes, craters, and so on, and then smuggled into China and so on. So all these were made Japan really wanted to attack Hong Kong even before Japan decided to declare war against Britain and the United States in December 1941, because Hong Kong was long seen as a loophole in the Japanese blockade of China. So because without Hong Kong, things could be quite difficult for the Chinese government, of course. And later on, of course, you have the Burma Road. The Chinese government could also import through the Burma Road, but Burma Road was also blocked in late 1940, and that is why Hong Kong was quite important as a window. But of course, after the fall of Hong Kong was still relevant because the Japanese forces used Hong Kong somehow as a logistics base to conduct to continue its campaign in Southeast Asia and South Pacific and so on. So Hong Kong somehow also played a similar role in the Japanese Empire throughout the Pacific War as well, even after the Japanese had controlled the city. But of course, you have the American Army Air Force attacked Hong Kong, gradually reduced the significance of Hong Kong in terms of logistics in the Japanese empire. So throughout the Second World War, you can see the changing strategic usefulness of Hong Kong. It's not always extremely relevant, but you can see the ups and downs and so on. One thing that was mentioned in many memoirs and accounts about the Battle of Hong Kong is that people assumed Hong Kong can be held for a very long time, sometimes as long as 6 months, half a year. In fact, among the commanders, as we discussed, among the commanders, they were not as optimistic. They were never nearly that optimistic. But on the other hand, as some of the more senior commanders, especially the commander-in-chief in the Far East, try to maintain that facade of strength. That is clearly an attempt to really, and as he himself admitted, the chief purpose of doing this is to comfort the allies and potential allies, especially China, Chiang Kai-shek, and of course the overseas Chinese and the Chinese and overseas Chinese living in all the European colonies in Asia, because if the position of strength is not shown, it's very difficult to see what would happen among these people. What would be their reactions? Some might be persuaded to turn to the Japanese and help them. So it was in this context that the British sort of faked the position of strength around the year before the war, especially after the fall of France, between the fall of France in mid-1940 to the outbreak of the Pacific War in December 1941. So they really had to do this in order to not just to comfort the potential allies and so on, but also to deter Japan from launching a war to seize the weakest link of the British Empire, just as Britain struggled in its war against Germany and Italy. So that strategy actually worked a bit, at least throughout the rest of 1940. Yeah, at least Japan decided not to attack. But of course, this was the Japanese assessment was sort of exaggerated as well. So the Japanese didn't really understand how strong the British positions were, and later on they find it out through capturing the British documents in late 1940. They did find out the British were actually in a very weak position. What stopped the Japanese from attacking immediately was not a successful British propaganda campaign, not exactly that, but it was the fear of an American intervention. So they sort of worried that if they attacked the British Empire in Asia immediately after the surrender of France, the USA would step in, and they were not sure whether they should fight the USA. So that was solved in late 1941. Of course, they finally decided to attack Pearl Harbor. So, but on the other hand, this British sort of an attempt to fake their strength actually persuaded many. So many fell into the trap, not just to an extent, not just the Japanese, but also the Chinese, because the Chinese, not just those in the officialdom, but also the general public, they were very surprised to see the kind of rapid fall of the British positions in Asia. Whether it was whether it was actually rapid, it's debatable. For example, holding Hong Kong for 18 days. Is it a very short or a long campaign? From the Japanese commander's perspective, it was actually longer than they expected. But on the other hand, from the perspective of the civilians, it could be seen as, oh, the British didn't fight well and Hong Kong fell for 18 days. But maybe from the British commander's perspective, it was already an achievement. So it's very difficult to say. But all in all, that those lies actually stayed. So you have sayings like Gibraltar of the East, this and that, all these videos of the British forces in Hong Kong and so on. So these are certainly attempts to delay the war, to deter the Japanese. Yeah. When we talk about the Battle of Hong Kong, sometimes it's quite difficult for us to really understand the other side of things, like the Japanese side. But surprisingly, the Japanese actually left many archival documents about their activities before the planning before the war, their military intelligence, and then their actual plans, and of course the war diaries of the Japanese units that attacked Hong Kong were also available. So there are many primary sources about the other side of the story, so which is good. Nowadays we have a better understanding. At least we can't say we know everything about that subject, but we have a better understanding about the Japanese side. For example, that the intelligence work of the Japanese forces in Hong Kong before the war. So there has been many saying that the Japanese has thorough understanding of the military defenses, the arrangements and so on of the British forces in Hong Kong before the war already. So there were stories about the spies infiltrating in different walks of life in Hong Kong, and they were ready to take over once the Japanese forces have arrived. So which is on the one hand, it's true. On the other, there are sometimes exaggerations and so on. So for example, you have the Japanese spies actually trying to communicate, to liaise with the local triads. To an extent, it was a success. For example, you have triads leading Japanese forces in Kowloon during the during the Battle of Hong Kong. But on the other hand, when the Japanese spies also tried to mobilize the triad forces to do something on Hong Kong Island, for example, to attack the European civilians and so on, they were stopped by other groups of triads under the influence and control of the Chinese nationalist forces, or sometimes paid by the local Hong Kong government as well. So the actual situation was actually more complicated. And for example, when we look into sometimes it's quite difficult to really assess the accuracy of the Japanese intelligence work, because how good it actually was. So you can't really have a very scientific standard to judge it. But sometimes we can really have a one or two examples to show how good it was. For example, when we look into the Japanese maps that were drafted before the battle, so the Japanese spies provided information for their staff officers to draw maps about Hong Kong and mark down the military structures and so on. So for example, when we are doing our when we are doing our interactive map project, we can compare all these maps with the actual location of the British defenses, and we have some interesting findings as well. For example, back in 1939, when the Japanese started to send spies to Hong Kong, their intelligence was actually fairly accurate. So for example, they could mark most of the positions of the Jinjinkas line, but they had limited success on Hong Kong Island, where security might be more tight. But especially after the outbreak of the European War, you can see the increased British protection of their sensitive information, and the intelligence quality of the Japanese side actually declined. When you have a look at the map used by the Japanese forces in December 1941, it's not extremely accurate in terms of military details of the British disposition. So, so as I said, just like the strategic relevance of Hong Kong, so this kind of things just goes up and down and so on and so on. So you can't really have a very clear conclusion about this. For example, the Japanese spies also planned to have terrorist attacks against the European civilians, for example, planting bombs or poisoning wells and so on, but these were not carried out. So when we talk about Japanese forces that attacked Hong Kong, we sometimes have the assumption that they were well trained and well equipped, and they of course they had what they wanted. Okay, they had what they needed to fight a battle. It was on the one hand true. Yeah, they brought with them heavy artillery. They had good air support. They were supported by a fleet, small fleet but still effective, and they were generally well fed and so on. But if we look into the detail of their military equipment, sometimes we have some interesting finds. For example, we after the battle they had a very comprehensive list of the type of ammunitions they expended during the battle. We can see they actually two of the Japanese regiments were equipped with at least some captured Chinese rifles. So of course they were making good use of the leftover by the Chinese forces on the one hand, but on the other it really shows that the long war between Japan and China that started in 1937, it actually caused something to the Japanese government. It was a strain to the Japanese economy as well. So they had to make full use of captured weapons. For example, throughout the Second World War, you wouldn't see in many cases American forces using captured Japanese or German equipment. That was not necessary because they had almost unlimited supply of things. So. But on the other hand, you can see from the Japanese forces that attacked Hong Kong used some, not all of them, of course, some Chinese rifles, Chinese field guns as well. One battalion was actually equipped with captured Chinese field guns that was captured in I think in Canton or even earlier as well. And when the Japanese forces arrived in Hong Kong, they spent much time trying to strip the wealth of Hong Kong from the people of Hong Kong. For example, most of the motor vehicles in Hong Kong were collected in several places. For example, like the race course and so on, and they were scavenged. All these parts and so on were removed. The usable parts were shipped back to Japan, and we had. After the Second World War, you have a list of things that were captured, taken away by the Japanese during the fall of Hong Kong, including all the way from rice stock to scientific equipment, books, even printers, printing machines, and even the two fire engines recently purchased by the Hong Kong government before the war. So all these shows that the Japanese actually had considerable material deficiencies by 1941 already, even before the war against the Americans. So you can see and another pretty striking thing when I look at those lists of Japanese materials is that the Japanese forces that attacked Hong Kong mainly relied on horses. They didn't really have many motor vehicles, except for the heaviest siege guns. So in most of the occasions, they had to rely on donkeys or horses, or of course manpower to move their assets, except for large siege guns that could only be moved by tractors or lorries. Other than that, the Japanese forces mostly relied on animal power. So just like the German forces at the beginning of the Second World War, we believe that Blitzkrieg, the German forces were of course fully motorized. This was not the case. This was not the case. So when the German forces attacked France, it still relied mainly on horses. It had several panzer divisions, of course, but the rest of the German forces had to rely on animal power. So the same case it was true for the Japanese forces that attacked Hong Kong. So so it's quite different from maybe some of the assumptions or that was being put forward many decades ago. Yeah. Yeah, when we talk about the British intelligence before the war, again, the shock of defeat has to be taken into account, because after the battle, everyone blamed the British intelligence for failing to basically do anything, to predict the invasion, to predict the time of an invasion, to predict the size of the forces that attacked Hong Kong, and so on and so on. For example, in the earlier dispatches written by Mokbey, he believed he was attacked by 3 divisions, which was of course not true. It was only one full division with an artillery brigade and supporting troops and so on. But the total number amounts to 40,000 something men, so that more or less like 2 divisions and so on. But the technical details aside, generally speaking, the British intelligence was, you can't really say it's accurate or inaccurate, because the intelligence thing is that you collect lots of information, you have to really select, and you have to really put things into context to understand. So there were many reports written by there was an intelligence organization called Far East Combined Bureau, which was the intelligence organization of the British forces in Asia, not just in Hong Kong, in the Far East, that existed before the Hong Kong. Its headquarters was in Hong Kong, later moved to Singapore after the outbreak of the European War, and then it has a branch in Hong Kong. You can see the reports, months and months of reports about the situation in Asia, assessment of the ability of the Japanese forces as well. So you can see many of these reports written before the war. And in fact, when you look into the detail, they were fairly accurate. They were actually fairly accurate in the description of the size of the Japanese forces across the border, for example, the capability of the Japanese air forces. This has raised some controversy, because many claim that there were officers who believed that the Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Force were ineffective. They claimed as such before the war, and they were proven wrong, of course. The Japanese air forces were fairly effective throughout the Pacific War. So sometimes mistakes were made. But these mistakes has to be put into context. For example, in the British report written before the war about the Japanese air forces effectiveness, they were describing the Japanese air forces that attacked China during the war. So from what they saw, it was not very effective, because by then the Japanese Army Air Forces were conducting the type of missions. So they were attacking. They believed they were not attacking first class European standard armed forces. So their approach were different. So what the British intelligence officers saw was not very effective. So that's why. So you have all these reports that must be put into context before we can say they're accurate or not. So, and then when we fast forward a bit to the few days before the outbreak of war, Mokbey believed that the Japanese were not coming, and then he changed his mind and he mobilized his garrison. But all these things happened within a few days, and sometimes he was blamed for not doing enough. But when we look into his own letters to his family in India, you can see he worried a lot about the situation. He believed war was coming, and he was not sure when it would happen. So, but you really can't blame him from my perspective. Of course, people get some of the scholars are more harsh to Mokbey, but I myself am not, because from his words, I would say he knows the international situation could change rapidly. He wrote about in his last letters before the war. He wrote about the situation in Russia. between the Soviet Union and German forces. They were fighting near Moscow already. So he was looking at that. He worried about Japan's attitude. He believed Japan could strike at any moment. And at the same time, he was dealing with a Hong Kong civilian government which was not extremely supportive in his war preparations. And he had a multinational garrison, which was a peacetime garrison, which was very difficult to put it in war footing. He lacked the resources that made the garrison work. He lacked many things from aircraft to armed fighting vehicles and so on, heavy weapons and so on. So he lacked many resources that could really help him. For example, maybe if he was given a squadron of tanks, he could do a lot more than he had already done during the Battle of Hong Kong. So in terms of war preparation, I think the most important thing is to put the whole situation in the context of a world war that was going on in not just in Europe, but also in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, in Africa and Central Asia, and so on and so on. It was a world war, and it was the Second World War Britain had experienced after the very costly First World War. So it was in this context that Maltby and his bosses in London were facing. But of course, some people could simply say, then why don't you just simply abandon the city, claim it an open city, turn it like something like an international settlement in Shanghai, let the Japanese in. Again, I think this kind of discussion has to be put in the context of the general situation of not just of the world, but also in Asia. So what would happen if Britain, as the status quo power, simply said, no, we're leaving Asia? What would be the consequences of that decision to, for example, Chiang Kai-shek's regime in China, to the overseas Chinese, to the Dominion countries, New Zealand, Australia, and of course to the United States, which when Roosevelt had to face a fairly strong isolationist trend in the country on the one hand, and on the other hand trying to prepare the country for war. So all these things have to be put in the context. So to me, that's why I wouldn't be too harsh to Maltby or to his staff about the coming of the battle, but because at least when Singapore told alerted Hong Kong on the 5th of December 1941, 2 days before the war, he mobilized the garrison. Hong Kong was actually, after all, one of the few garrisons in Asia, the European garrisons in Asia, that was in full war footing when the Japanese forces arrived. So to me, at least they have done somehow better compared to other European colonial forces in different parts of Asia. So during the 1930s and 40s, in fact, all throughout the Cold War as well, to an extent, Hong Kong was the sort of a port of refuge for people who wanted to escape from war disturbances and all sorts of things in mainland China. So during the 1930s, when the Japanese forces attacked Shanghai and then the rest of China and Guangdong, and many moved into Hong Kong as refugees, as we said. And during the Japanese occupation, since Hong Kong was a port city, it could not sustain itself, and the Japanese forces had no means to feed the population, so it started to really force the people to move away from Hong Kong. So you witnessed the decline of the population of Hong Kong from more than 1.5 million to 500,000 by the end of the war. So more than 1 million left Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation. And then many returned after the war because of many different reasons. So part of the modern history of Hong Kong was this. A very important part of this history of Hong Kong is the movement of people in and out of Hong Kong, and amidst this large flow of people, they also brought resources, capital, and sometimes culture, and many different things. So people they didn't just come and go as many assumed, because sometimes Hong Kong was described as a migrant city, and everyone were not ready to settle here, no permanent population. To a very large extent, this is untrue, because as one Japanese civilian official noted in 1944, many of those who were forced to leave Hong Kong were actually Hong Kong local residents who settled here for many generations. So when the Japanese forces started to kick people out of Hong Kong, they assumed everyone had an ancestral home back in mainland China, which is untrue, because some of these people had many generations settled in Hong Kong. So, but on the other hand, they were forced to move out. So that's why after the war, many decided to return to Hong Kong. And of course, after the Second World War, the political situation in China again started to decline, and you started to have many more refugees going to Hong Kong after the Second World War, and especially during and after the Chinese Civil War as well. So that is why you can see from during this perspective, during this period at least, Hong Kong was generally seen as a place of refuge, but not just for the Chinese. I have to emphasize on this, because at the same time you have the White Russians, who also settled from different parts of China to Hong Kong as well. And after the war, many chose to leave for other places like Canada, Australia, and the United States. Some decided to stay, and as well. So Hong Kong became a port of refuge for many different types of people. It's not just the Chinese, but also the stateless people, but also, as I said, the White Russians and maybe Portuguese and so on and so on. So it really was a place for those in need. Back in the 1930s, where Shanghai was actually one of the truly international cities in Asia, which was, of course, similar to what it is nowadays. So Shanghai at that time was not one city, it was actually separated into two parts. One was the Chinese side, which was under the control of the Chinese nationalist government, and on the other side you have the international settlement, which was governed by an international committee. So it was a extremely modern city by any standard of the time, and it was a highly commercialized society. It was immensely rich, immensely wealthy in terms of material, culture, and so on, and it attracts the international attention. So when war started between Japan and the Chinese nationalist government in 1937, it really draws everyone's attention to the city, because and that is why Chiang Kai-shek threw his lots to Shanghai, because he sent all his best troops to Shanghai to fight a very large scale battle. The original intention was to have a victory over the Japanese forces in front of the international audience in Shanghai, because it was basically the nerve center in Asia. So what happened in Shanghai would be known by the rest of the world quickly. So it's not like you have defeated the Japanese forces in like say Xuzhou, inside Jiangsu province. It's far away from the international attention. But if you have scored a win in Shanghai at the very beginning of the war, you will immediately win lots of international attention and perhaps support. So that is why Shanghai became a battlefield. But of course, the Japanese forces had the upper hand, and of course gradually controlled the area, and even pushed towards Nanjing, and you had the Nanjing massacre, the rape of Nanjing, and so on. So, but throughout all these events, you can see the international settlement was still under international control. The Japanese forces did not occupy it until the outbreak of the Pacific War in December 1941. So you had a kind of an embarrassing situation for everyone, because you have a city that was still running, but losing its former glory because of what happened surrounding immediately out of the city. And for example, when the Chinese nationalist forces were defeated, they left a battalion to hold one of the warehouses that was placed very close to the international settlement. So that particular battalion fought a last stand in that warehouse for days in front of the international settlement, in front of basically everyone's eyes, and the unit was told to fight to the last, because as basically as a more like a propaganda for the rest of the world to see the resistance of the Chinese resistance. That battalion eventually withdrew to the international settlement, of course, and then later on. And of course, this story was well known in China and in Taiwan, in the rest of the world, and there were several movies about it as well. And then you have after the fall of Shanghai, the Chinese side of Shanghai, you started to have lots of refugees leaving the city, including from the international settlements to Hong Kong. So it was of course to those who were from Shanghai, Hong Kong was less modernized. To some, it was unacceptably backward, and compared to Shanghai in many different senses. And then, as the Japanese forces progressed along the China coast, especially after they occupied Canton and parts of Guangdong province in 1938, more refugees came to Hong Kong, but this time from different classes, because the previous wave of the refugees were more wealthy people who were from Shanghai, and then you have the less well-to-do people from the Guangdong province also entered Hong Kong. So suddenly the population of Hong Kong surged to more than 1.5 million. So it was really a big thing for the colonial government, because it gave immense pressure for the government to take care of them. So after the fall of Hong Kong, so when the Japanese forces occupied Hong Kong, the Chinese nationalist government almost immediately wanted to ask the British to return, so-called return Hong Kong to them, through the negotiations and so on. So, but the British rejected, of course. They said things cannot be negotiated during the war. So if you want any negotiations, it should be started after the war. So let's deal with Japan first. That's basically what Britain said throughout the war. So but of course, Chiang Kai-shek wanted Hong Kong, wanted to take Hong Kong back, because it was generally the Chinese nationalist policy of abolishing all the unequal treaties, what they called unequal treaties, in the 1930s and 40s, and of course he was supported by Roosevelt, the U.S. president. And so basically throughout the war you have something like a Sino-American sort of a alliance on this matter, to pressure Britain to return Hong Kong to the Chinese government. But this did not take place, because by 1944, you have by late 1944, the Japanese launched the Operation Ichigo, which allowed the Japanese forces to really take almost like full control of the provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi. So before that, you had nationalist Chinese forces that were deployed near Hong Kong in southern part of Guangdong province, even though the Japanese forces were in control of Canton and Hong Kong. But after the Operation Ichigo, you didn't really have many Chinese nationalist forces, especially the regular forces in the area. So the area was basically divided up by the Japanese forces, Chinese Communist guerrilla, and some of the Chinese nationalist guerrilla forces as well, but which were not very strong. So by the end of the war, when Japan surrendered, so there were no Chinese nationalist forces in size near Hong Kong. So they were unable to just march into Hong Kong and take back Hong Kong. That was not possible. The closest large formation in the area was in Guangxi, under the Chinese nationalist government control. And the Chinese communist guerrilla were unable to control Hong Kong. They were not large enough in the area as well. So they had some units in Hong Kong, but they were not large enough to challenge a Japanese garrison there. The Japanese garrison was not strong, but still it was a force to be reckoned with. So the Japanese forces in Hong Kong didn't really know to whom they should surrender to. They asked Nanjing, the higher level of Japanese command, who could not give any answer. They also asked Tokyo, who could not answer. So at the end of the day, the long story short, it was basically the negotiation between the U.S., China, the Chinese nationalist government, and Britain. So Britain was allowed to temporarily return to Hong Kong and allow the Chinese nationalist forces to use Hong Kong as a springboard to be shipped to different parts of China, to the Japanese occupied area. So at the end of the day, the Japanese forces surrendered first to the British Armed Forces, Harcourt's fleet that entered Hong Kong on 30th of August, and then you have a ceremony that was participated by the representatives from China, from Britain, from the Commonwealth countries, and of course from the US, with the Japanese representatives. So it was very complicated, but it really shows the international relevance of the place and all these interlocking treaties, commitments, and so on, and the alliances and so on. So you can also see that even though even though Britain, USA, and China were fighting against a common enemy of Japan on the one hand, but on the other, they sometimes had different visions of the post-war world. So they would act accordingly. And they would sort of just compete against each other. Because, for example, towards the final months of the war, you have increased OSS activities in the area. OSS was Office of Strategic Services, which was basically an American intelligence organization. So they worked in South China as well. They cooperated with the Chinese guerrilla forces, both the nationalists, the communists, or even the local guerrilla forces. They also worked with the BAAG, but also in a sort of a competition between the OSS and the British Army 8 group exist. So you have all these things going on, makes things really intriguing, especially in this part of the war. So it's not like a very clear line between us and the enemy. So sometimes the Second World War was portrayed as such, as the Allies and the Axis forces, and the fighting line was extremely clear. But in the context of South China and Hong Kong at least, things are more blurred. You have gray area and so on. So and you can see the differences between the Allies and so on, even between the Japanese army and the Navy, that had very different understanding of the situation and had very different approaches to that situation. So it makes things really diverse and interesting. Yeah. By late 1941, the Japanese was actually in an awkward position. The Japanese government was actually in a fairly awkward position. It could not really stop the war in China. It could not bring the war in China in a successful conclusion. It didn't really have a victory narrative saying that, okay, we won this and we could leave. If they just pull out from China, it's an admission of defeat. If they continue the war, it is increasingly costly and there is no end in sight. But on the other hand, the situation sort of forced them to, in response to the American and potential American and British intervention of the situation in Asia, and of course in China as well, and the US was demanding the Japanese to pull out. So in fact, the Japanese Japanese government didn't really have a very clear view of the end game of the whole thing. So that's very problematic. Because on the other hand, its propaganda machine was telling its people they were winning victories after victory and the end is in sight. But from the Japanese people's perspective, they actually knew better. They were not Japanese people were no fools. They were not easily fooled by the Japanese propaganda machine, because around them they could see the cost of the war. The quality of their living declined. The lack of resources was apparent. There is no general hunger happened in Japan in 1941, not yet, but they could feel the lack of resources. For example, foreign goods disappeared, rice became more expensive, and the 4 years of war in China brought lots of casualties as well. So all the villages, they would lose someone. Yeah. And all these news and so on, the war weariness accumulated. So by 1941, the Japanese people were already quite fed up with the war. So it was actually very, very lucky for the Japanese government and its military leadership to have all these stunning victories over the European powers in the first months of the Pacific War that made the Japanese continue to go on and on. So and of course you had more clear-minded Japanese were silenced by the Kempeitai, by the special police, Japanese special police, that sort of constable in the Japanese militarist government. So all these I forgot the word. All these dissidents were silenced effectively, but towards the end of the war, from late 1943 onwards, you started to see not even the Japanese civilian politicians could be silenced. So they started to really think of ways to get Japan out of this desperate situation, because the war could not be won. Now you can't end the war in China. The army always promised the next campaign would destroy the nationalist government, peace could be achieved. But on the other hand, you were already in a war against the United States and Britain. That could not be won. So by late 1943 and 44, early 44, the Japanese civilian government started to do something about it, and that led to the resignation of Tojo. And then later on, of course, the army remained in control. The militarists remained in control. But as the situation declined, they started to lose the absolute control, and the civilians started to express their wariness about the war, and that is why by August 1945 you started to have basically a general understanding that the war could not be won. So when the Emperor of Japan decided to accept the Potsdam demands, decided to surrender, only a small number of army officers resist. The rest of the country actually accepted what had happened. So that is why. After the fall of Hong Kong, there was discussion among some of the British officials about whether they should keep Hong Kong after the war, especially in the context when the nationalist government demanded to take Hong Kong. So there were diverse opinions among different departments, the colonial office, the foreign office, and so on. So they were saying that why are we going to keep this place? Because militarily we cannot hold it. It was very costly to keep this city. We may not be able to, if we can have trade deals with China, whoever controls that country, and we don't need Hong Kong. Yeah, as long as we keep a good relationship with the Chinese government that controlled the entire country. So there was some ideas around this. But on the other hand, you have opinions saying that, well, we created the modern city out of basically nothing from their perspective. And on the other hand, we were actually proud of our work, and locals, they were not exactly very supportive, but they accepted our rule. They were not demanding independence or demanding to be integrated in other political bodies in China. So that was another fashion's understanding of things. So of course the situation dictated what happened afterwards, but there was an idea that if Hong Kong was to be kept as a British possession, colony or what you name it, it seems that the new government that took back Hong Kong after the war had to be more responsive to local aspirations and local demands on social economic advances. So that is why after the Second World War you had a colonial government which was more responsive to the local needs and demands, and sometimes even to the extent that the local government was stood up against the demands from the metropole from London. The demands from London could be rejected by Hong Kong government. There would be negotiations between the Hong Kong government and the government in London. And because of this sort of a new a new understanding of the British rule in Hong Kong. It was not just maintaining, running the show of free trade, laissez-faire, and the government did nothing other than facilitate the Hong's, the great trading companies' interest. More attention was paid to the local population. You started to have more things like public housing, changes in education, public health, mass transit, better infrastructure, and all these things. So the war experience to an extent changed the British rule in Hong Kong in certain ways. I'm not saying that it was entirely for the people, by the people thing, but they certainly understand the needs to respond to the local demands. After all, it was a British possession along the China coast, so they had to respond to the local population. So that change was actually fairly apparent in the subsequent decades after the war. And of course, you also have a group of British, or not just the British, a group of expatriates who experienced the war in Hong Kong and South China and started to see this place their home. And they also contributed a lot in the post-war reconstruction and so on. For example, one example would be Sir Lindsay Wright, who taught in Hong Kong U before the war, became the head of the British Army Aid Group during the war, and afterwards became the Chancellor of Hong Kong U, and did lots of public works in Hong Kong in the post-war Hong Kong. So all these things added up as well. So it was not a very straightforward story, again, as all historical stories are. So you have this more very colorful changes and so on. From the study of this particular part of history of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong during the 1930s to 1950s around, we can really clearly see the diversity of Hong Kong's population. So people literally from around the world came. You had, of course, Europeans, Americans, and those from the Middle East, overseas Chinese, people from South Asia as well. So many, and of course from different parts of China as well. So all these people came, and some, of course, some stayed for only for a while. They left for other places, but many did stay in Hong Kong for generations. And for example, if we look into the names and the backgrounds of the members of the Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Force, you can see from many diverse background, religion and culture and so on. So and sometimes it was a difficulty for the commanders, because you are commanding a group of soldiers who spoke very different languages from different social classes and cultural backgrounds. But on the other hand, it's a reflection of the unique historical experience of Hong Kong as a place where people can really. It's not saying that they merged into the same group of people. Not exactly that. It's not like a melting pot thing. But on the other hand, they different groups kept their culture. They had different religious sites, their social space, their clubs, and so on. Their own cultural environment as well. So they had their own literary scenes as well. So you had Portuguese painters, Chinese literary scholars, this and that. So everyone were in Hong Kong. So it's not like they melted together, but rather they kept their uniqueness, yet they could work with each other in the society. So it was this unique historical experience that fascinates me, and to an extent, this is sort of the unique historical experience of Hong Kong until nowadays.